Hello and thank you for popping by for today's video, in which I'm going to talk about all the books I read since my last wrap-up, which was in July. Now today is the 1st of November, so I have a total of 15 books to talk about from the months of October, September and August. So that's gonna be a lot of books, so let's just jump right into it. And I need to consult my phone for Goodreads for this because I will never remember all the books by myself. But the very first book I finished in August was for the Invisible Cities project for Lebanon, because it is a book which is set in Beirut. So it is An Unnecessary Woman by Rabih Alameddine. And in this one we follow at this older woman who now lives in Beirut, and she has lived her whole life more or less alone in her apartment after her husband divorced her. So she is kind of an outcast, but she's also deeply introverted and she likes her own space and she likes her freedom, and she really doesn't want to give it up despite her family trying to remarry her or trying to persuade her to give up that apartment, that little space she has all for herself. This is the story of this older woman, this bookworm. She works in a bookstore and in her spare time she translates her favorite books into Arabic. So each year she has one book she translates, and then at the end of the year she puts it in a box and stores it away. So in that apartment she has a whole room, or several rooms maybe, filled to the brim with boxes and boxes and boxes, and those boxes are her life. I really loved to be in her world and in her space and follow her along. So this book covers spans of decades, because now when we starting this book, she's in like her late 60s, early 70s, something like that. And when she divorced, she was still a young girl. So we follow through her life. We also follow the events of Lebanon and the city Beirut. So we get a feeling of what happened in the span of that history as well. So it is a good book to read if you want to read about life in Beirut in the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years. But also it's a great book to read if you want to understand the role of women in Lebanon and in Beirut and in that society in which women are kind of outcasts if they're not married, don't have children, and they just want to work for a living. The next book I finished is a memoir, and it is My Past is a Foreign Country by Zeba Talkhani. I picked this up specifically because it is said that this is a book about this woman who grew up in Saudi Arabia, and I wanted to read more about growing up as a woman in that environment. And she is from a Muslim Indian background. So her father was stationed, got work in Saudi Arabia, and that's why they moved there with her family. And that's where she spent the first, I don't know how many years of her life. She got into university in India, and from there she went on an exchange student visa for a period to Germany, and afterwards, I don't know if exactly afterwards or after she finished university, she settled in the UK. And of course, throughout this book, we see all of her experiences when it comes to all the different cultures and all the different people she encounters. And of course, a lot of people ask her about her experience growing up in Saudi Arabia, but that's not the main focus of this book. It is also focusing on her relationship with her mother, which was kind of strained. They didn't really talk a lot. And also a big part of this book is her experience with hair loss. So when she was younger, she started experiencing hair loss, and this affected her for the rest of her life, because hair loss, especially when coming from that culture, is really impacting your image. And of course, it would impact everyone, I would say, but especially in a culture where so much emphasis is put on appearance, on being beautiful, because then you were more marriageable or you would find a husband much easier. So she really felt that was really impacting her in a negative way, and I really understand why. And it was kind of hard to read about those specific moments, because it felt like her family didn't really deal with the situation as best as they could. A lot of this book is about her experience as a Muslim woman with an Indian, Saudi Arabian background, and how she was pushed to get married and focus on being a wife and a mother, as opposed to what she really wanted, and that was having an education and a career. But we have to also think about the fact that her parents were actually quite supportive, and they really let her to go and live her dream and get an education. So in a way, she comes from a really happy background, as in her parents were really supportive. And of course, we hear about her friends and acquaintances, other women, girls who weren't so lucky, but her situation was quite a lucky one. So overall, I feel like this gave me a great insight into her life and her experiences in those different countries she lived in. But I wanted something more in-depth, and that was really not the case here. The next book I read was Confessions of the Lioness by Mia Couto. I picked this book up also for the Invisible Cities project for Mozambique. I would recommend this book for you, especially if you like very poetic writing and if you like magical realism. But this book really was just not for me, and that is because of the magical realism. I think the writing felt too poetic at times, and just the story too abstract because of the magical realism, that most of it just kind of went above my head. And that's a shame, especially because this is quite a short book. So basically we follow two characters, and the story is set in this really remote Mozambique village, in which people live with quite dated beliefs and values, and they give a lot of importance to superstitious belief as well. And throughout this book and this story and the two characters we follow, we get this feeling of how a woman's life is and what her role is, and how limited her life and her possibilities are because of all this superstitious belief, and because of what a woman should do and where the woman should go and what should her role be in life. So we follow, one of the characters is actually a hunter. He comes to this village to hunt down this lioness who is killing women. And then we follow a young girl who is living in this village, and her sister was killed by the lioness. So it is a beautiful allegorical story, but as I said, it really went above my head. And I really didn't like, if this is a story which was supposed to depict the lives of women, I just didn't like the way it portrayed some of these women, especially because we had a character who was a bit overweight, and the way she was portrayed and the way her weight was almost described or referred to in every single paragraph this character appeared in, just really didn't really, it was just felt like it didn't really date so well. But overall, it is an interesting story because it focuses so much on the role of women. I just wish it would have been written by a woman from Mozambique who with Mozambique background, and not a man with a Portuguese background. But that's the way it is. It is hard sometimes to find books translated to English from countries in Africa, and that's something I experienced while researching other books and other countries for the Invisible Cities project. The next book I read was The Shadow King by Maaza Mengiste, and this is the book I picked up for the Invisible Cities project for Ethiopia. So in this book, we follow characters during the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia by Mussolini. And we follow specifically different set of characters on both ends, so both some Italians and Ethiopians. But at the core of this story, we follow some women who participated in the resistance and in the fight against the Italians, and what their role was, because of course history doesn't really acknowledge the role of women in these situations. And I really love the premise of this book, but unfortunately I really did not gel with the structure of it. So I listened to it, and maybe that was the wrong for me to do, but it just felt like I didn't really feel like I could follow the story so well. It just all blended together, especially because we follow kind of two timelines. One is the present time, when someone goes back to Ethiopia, and kind of through that journey back, we kind of go back in time and explore what happened back then. But it all kind of felt like blended together, the characters blended together, and I couldn't really separate the timelines. I couldn't really separate the different plot lines as well. So it was a really, really hard one to read and follow. It kind of was a struggle. I'm not sure what else to tell you about it, because I just feel like I can't really recommend this book, because I just couldn't get into it. And I just feel like this could have been so much better if it would have been restructured and would have focused on maybe less people or a more streamlined plot line. I don't know, you tell me. Have you read this? What do you think about it? The next book was again one for the Invisible Cities Project, and this time for Panama. And it is the book of Unknown Americans by Cristina Henriquez. Now, this was a much different reading experience. It basically follows a couple and their daughter from Mexico who had to go to the US because their daughter suffered an accident in Mexico, and the only good care they could find was in the US. So they emigrated to the US, and this is a story of what happened there and how they found a community of also different immigrants living in the same apartment building. And it was a little bit about their backgrounds as well, and how they form the group of unknown Americans. So people really living at the edge of society, people taking really hard jobs and just struggling and trying to fit in and trying to find a place for themselves. At the heart of this story, though, is this young girl who went to the US with her parents, and how she struggles as well to be better, or to overcome her illness and her situation, and how she fell in love with this boy, her neighbor. And it's just a beautiful but also heartbreaking story, because there's so much struggle in it, so much the struggle of being an immigrant in the US. So I can highly, highly recommend it. And I think I will definitely pick up more of this author's books. The next book I read was also one for the Invisible Cities Project, and it was for Peru. So it was a book by Mario Vargas Llosa, which I think is a must-read if you want to read books by Peruvian authors. I read Aunt Julia and the Scriptwriter, and it was such a fun experience, let me tell you. The chapters are alternating between our main character, who is leading the news department at the local radio station, which hires this very famous scriptwriter who writes soap operas. The next chapter is always a different soap opera. And all of these chapters about soap operas are just so wild and so funny and so outrageous and dramatic and out there that it was just amazing. I loved it, especially considering that I grew up watching South American telenovelas. So I know this world. And throughout the continuation of this novel, this scriptwriter slowly goes insane because characters start to just get mixed, and they appear in the wrong soap opera, and there's just no way to figure out who's who and who's done what and how to separate these soap operas. And I think it's just a beautiful commentary on the whole soap opera genre, because after you watched as many as, or more than one, I would say, then you immediately see the recurring themes and tropes. And it was just also amazing to see how the whole city of Lima, in which this is set in, was just enraptured by these soap operas, and how they also got so confused because they were still following all of these different soap operas, and they just like couldn't understand why is this person doing in this soap opera when he is supposed to be in the other one. And it was just so funny. It was just so funny. So I don't know if this book will be though for everyone, but I think it was such a hilarious read, and I will definitely pick up more of Mario Vargas Llosa's books because I really love his writing style. The next book I read was Know My Name by Chanel Miller, which is another memoir in which Chanel writes about what happened after she was sexually assaulted when she went to this college party at Stanford with her sister, and how she dealt with that, or the aftermath of that, and how she went to court and how she fought so hard to get justice for herself, because her case was like so similar to all other cases in which the victim is really blamed and the perpetrator is portrayed as this innocent young man with a bright future, and whose future should not be determined by this one act of mistake. So it seems like the whole system, the whole society, and the whole media was against her, and it was just so hard to read, and especially as a woman, because she was blamed for going to that party with her sister. She was blamed for wearing whatever she was wearing, for drinking. It's normal to drink at a party, so why should that go against you, and why should that be important? It was such a well-told story, and it was so heartbreaking to read. I would definitely recommend it for everyone. So if you don't know her case, I think her story went viral after BuzzFeed published her victim statement, and it was viewed by more than 11 million people in the span of 4 days. So you probably heard about this story. If you haven't read it yet, I would highly, highly recommend that you do so. The next book I read was Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. In this book, we follow Jenin, who is a young black woman living in the South in the US. She has been raised by her grandmother, and her grandmother is a very old woman, and she wants to kind of make sure that Jenin has a good future. So she's married off at a really, really early age to this older black man who has a farm. And of course, Jenin is not really happy in this marriage because she wants to live her own life and make her own decisions and just live the life she wants. So throughout this really short book, we follow Jenin, and we follow her through the 3 marriages she has, and we follow her trying to keep true to herself when everyone wants something from her, and everyone wants her to behave in a certain way, or to just fit into their own imagination of how she should behave or who she should be. It is beautifully told. It is written in a very with a dialect. So for me, it was kind of hard to follow the American dialect from the South. But nonetheless, I think that took me a bit out of the story. But overall, I feel this is such a beautiful, impactful story and a true modern classic from the US. The next book I read was also one for the Invisible Cities project, and this time for Barbados. And it was How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Cherie Jones. Now, when I picked this up, I didn't know that this is a debut. And I have to tell you after reading it that as a debut and as a book in general, this was just phenomenal. It was such a heartbreaking story, but such a beautifully told story. So the book is set on this island, which is like a paradise. But it seems like this island is a paradise only to the people who come to visit it, not for the people actually living in it, because their lives, it just seems like like misery. There's just so much generational trauma, violence against women, and just poverty in general, that it's hard for them to break out of that cycle. And it's just hard for them to see all those people coming and just living their best lives and having all the money, when they have to struggle so much. And it's just like a book about strong contrast and how that life of poverty makes them do violent things at the end. And the focus is really on this one couple, and this young woman marries this man who turns out to be really abusive. They have a child together, and the story is about how she tries to escape that increasingly abusive man and how hard that is, especially since this violence against women was also something both her mother and her grandmother lived through. The next book I read was again for the Invisible Cities project, and this time for Chile. I read In the Midst of Winter by Isabel Allende. I have previously tried to read another book by Isabel Allende and I DNF'd that, even though that book is much more popular. I can't recall its name, but I was really determined to find and read a book by a Chilean author, and Isabel Allende was kind of like the only name I could find where I also had access to her books. So if you have any other author you would recommend me, a Chilean author who writes books set in Chile, then please let me know, because this book was not set in Chile. One of the characters was from Chile, but this book is set in America. It follows these three people who kind of end up together because of this mystery. And through that mystery and through that time they spend together, we get to know their backgrounds, because they all have lived or come from different countries from South America. So we follow an older man who is American but has lived many years in Brazil. And then we follow an older woman who comes from Chile and now works in the US as a professor. And then the third one is an illegal immigrant, a young woman from Guatemala. Throughout these events that kind of tie them together, and this mystery, which is at the kind of the central plot, even though it's kind of a weak plot, I feel, because for the most part, we look at these people and their backgrounds from when they were living in South America. I don't know if it makes sense. I just feel like this didn't work for me, because I would either have read about these people's lives in South America, in whichever of these three countries, Chile, Guatemala, or Brazil, it doesn't matter. Or I would have rather read the story about that mystery and how those three people got together. But it was kind of a mishmash of different things, and I just don't think that really worked for me so well. But Isabel Allende is so well known and loved for her historical fiction, so if you love historical fiction, you would probably love this one as well. The next book I read was Mornings in Jenin by Susan Albuhawa, and this is a book also that I read for the Invisible Cities project for Palestine. I have earlier this year read The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé, which is a non-fiction book written by this Israeli author, which details what happened in 1948 after the Brits left Palestine, and during which year the Israelis systematically pushed out and killed and did horrible things to the Palestinians and their villages. So a lot of Palestinians have been made refugees during that time, and this is kind of at the core of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict, basically. In this book, we follow this family and this community of Palestinians who have been, again, pushed out, some of them killed during this time, and they have been made refugees and then went to live in Jenin in a refugee camp for most of them for the rest of their lives, and how hard that life was in that refugee camp, because of course there was a life of privation. It was a life in which they were still constantly under attack, and they've been attacked while living in that refugee camp and killed as well. And it was just not an easy life. At the central of this story is this family, and we follow in particular this young girl who is the great granddaughter of one of the main figures we meet at the beginning of this book. And throughout her life, we follow her and we kind of see what happens to her family and to her close friends. And there's just horrible things. And she ends up in the US and kind of escapes that world. But her family, friends, and even husband is back there and still living under constant threat and afraid of being killed. If you haven't read any book by a Palestinian about this experience, there are so many books out there, and I would highly recommend you to pick one up, if not this one. The next book I read was for October, and I read The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. I've been meaning to read this book for quite a while, so I'm really happy I managed to read it for this October. And it wasn't really what I expected. I expected something with much more horrific vibes, a la Frankenstein maybe, but this was really like a moral story, and it was much less plot focus than I expected, and really just a character focus and the story of this young man who kind of sold his soul to the devil and wanted to be beautiful forever because society basically told him that his looks are the most valuable asset he has in this world. I want to reread this and just take my time with it, because I think listening to it, I just maybe read it or listened much faster, and I would rather spend a bit more time with this character and look at the broader society and the meaning behind what happened to this young man. Next, I quite randomly picked up a romance book, which I thought is going to be like a young adult fantasy, but it turned out to be a smutty romance, and it was A Touch of Darkness by Scarlett Sinclair, and it is a Hades and Persephone retelling. I really like the reimagining of this world, because in this world the gods are real, and they have reformed the earth and they made themselves known to the humans, so they kind of live among them. We follow Persephone, who is the goddess of spring, but her mother really kept her closeted for most of her life and was really overprotective. So she doesn't really know herself, know her powers as a goddess. All she wants to do is just live in the normal world and just work as a journalist. She then meets, of course, Hades, who is the god of the underworld, and of course they form a relationship. And it was an interesting premise, but it turned out to be much less plotty than I wanted it to, and much more smut than maybe I expected. I don't know. It is what it is. Yeah, there's not much else to say about it. And then I finished the second book in the First Law trilogy by Joe Abercrombie, Before They Are Hanged. And this is a fantasy and a well-known and much-loved fantasy series in which we follow this group of characters who kind of go on a quest in this second book. So I don't think I want to tell you a lot about this second book because it is a second in the series. But if you love a slow-paced, character-focused fantasy set in a medieval type of world, this is one I would highly recommend. It is so well told, and these characters are just amazing. So if you haven't given this author and this series a go, please do so, because I mean, you must have heard about this series or this author if you like fantasy, because this book is on a lot of those must-read fantasy series lists out there. The last book I read was also for October, and it was Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I picked this up because one of the prompts for October this year was to read a Victorian sensation novel, and Lady Audley's Secret was one of the most recommended books for this prompt. Now, this is a mystery, and for me, I can only compare it to, if I need to compare it to books I read previously, I would very much like to compare it to Anne Radcliffe's A Sicilian Romance, which is a gothic novel, because this one, it feels like, has a lot of those gothic dark elements. It has theft, insanity, child abuse, bigamy. It is set in this big old house, which was maybe a monastery, or it feels like it was a monastery at some time. And it was just, it had so many of those wild elements, so I can really see why it is recommended as a sensation novel and why it was so popular when it came out. And for me personally, it was too long, because I'm not used to reading mysteries which are so long and so character focused, but at the same time really plotless in a way. Of course, there's a central plot line, but I feel like there was just so much meandering and focusing on the male main character who tried to find out Lady Audley's secret, and a lot of what happened on page was happening actually inside his head and not in outside action. I'm not sure how to explain it. He kind of told what happened instead of us going with him and seeing what actually happened, if that makes sense. I don't know, I just felt like it was too long, and it dragged out, and I didn't really know where this was going. I didn't really know what to expect, because the mystery was also quite clear from the start, so it's not like we had to kind of guess what's going to happen. What I can say is that at the end there was a twist I really didn't expect, and I enjoyed that. So yeah, there were still some things that could surprise me, despite it being so obvious. So these are all the books I have read these past 3 months. As you could tell, there was a lot of focus on the Invisible Cities project, and I really enjoyed the books I picked up for those and the insight it gave me into those specific countries. But I also feel that those books were kind of on the heavier side for the most part, and they really affected my mood, my reading mood, so to speak. So yeah, that young adult fantasy I wanted to pick up there was really not what I wanted to read, but it was good as a good mental break from all the other heavier books. We are moving into November now, and I will definitely focus more on nonfiction books. If you haven't checked out my TBR, I will link it for you below and in the cards. But this is where I will leave you today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.